What if I told you that under one president, unemployment hit record lows and the stock market soared? But under the other, America saw one of the fastest job recoveries in modern history? Was the economy really stronger under Donald Trump? Or did Joe Biden lead a better financial comeback after crisis? From tax cuts and Wall Street booms to inflation spikes and stimulus checks, today we break down the real numbers, the real policies, and the real impact on your wallet. No politics, no bias, just facts. Let's find out. Who was truly better for American finances? When Americans compare economic performance between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the debate often becomes political. However, the economic story is much more complex than party lines. Each president governed under very different global and domestic conditions, which makes direct comparison challenging. To fairly evaluate who was better for American finances, we must examine employment, GDP growth, tax policy, inflation, stock market performance, wages, and crisis management. Donald Trump took office in January 2017 during a steady economic expansion that had already been underway for several years. One of the most significant economic policies during his administration was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This legislation reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and lowered income tax rates for many Americans. Supporters argued that these tax cuts encouraged businesses to invest, hire more workers, and expand operations within the United States. Between 2017 and early 2020, the unemployment rate fell to historic lows. Minority unemployment rates also reached record levels. The stock market experienced strong growth, with major indexes hitting new highs. Business optimism remained elevated. Many Americans felt confident about the direction of the economy during this period. However, in early 2020, the landscape changed. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically changed the economic landscape. Businesses shut down and supply chains were disrupted. Unemployment spiked to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The federal government responded with large stimulus packages. Joe Biden assumed office in January 2021 during the pandemic recovery phase. His administration passed the American Rescue Plan, which included additional stimulus payments and support for local governments. The labor market rebounded quickly during 2021 and 2022. Millions of jobs were added as businesses reopened. However, inflation became a significant issue. Rising energy costs and supply chain disruptions contributed to price increases. The Federal Reserve responded to inflation by raising interest rates, which affected mortgage rates and business borrowing costs. This created mixed economic signals: strong job growth, but rising financial pressure on households. It makes simple comparisons incomplete. In the next section, we will examine GDP and overall growth performance. Let's look at the numbers. To seriously compare the financial impact of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, we must look closely at gross domestic product, GDP, which measures the total value of goods and services produced in the United States. GDP growth is one of the clearest indicators of overall economic health. During Trump's presidency, the U.S. economy saw consistent growth. Annual GDP growth averaged around 2 to 3%, with 2018 being one of the strongest years due to the impact of tax cuts and increased business investment. Corporate tax reductions encouraged companies to repatriate overseas profits and increase capital spending. Business confidence surveys showed strong optimism. Supporters argued that Trump's deregulation policies reduced burdens on industries such as energy, manufacturing, and finance. Energy production increased significantly, making the U.S. one of the world's leading oil producers. Manufacturing jobs also saw growth before 2020. However, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a historic economic collapse. GDP contracted sharply as lockdowns spread across the country. Although the economy began recovering later that year, the overall annual growth rate for 2020 was negative due to the scale of the crisis. When Biden took office in 2021, the economy was already rebounding from pandemic lows. Massive federal spending and reopening efforts led to rapid growth. That year saw one of the strongest annual growth rates in decades, largely driven by pent-up consumer demand and stimulus spending. However, growth began slowing in 2022 and 2023 as inflation rose and the Federal Reserve increased interest rates to cool the economy. Higher borrowing costs reduced business expansion. Despite these challenges, the U.S. avoided a deep recession during that period. One key difference between both presidencies is context. Trump inherited an expanding economy, while Biden inherited an economy in crisis. Another important factor is national debt. Under Trump, deficits increased through tax cuts. Under Biden, they remained high due to stimulus and infrastructure. The debate centers on sustainability, whether tax cuts added too much to the deficit or if aggressive stimulus overheated the economy and fueled inflation. In the next section, we will examine unemployment, job creation, and labor market strength. Because for most Americans, jobs matter more than GDP. For most Americans, the most important economic question is simple. Are there jobs available and are wages growing? To compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden fairly, we must examine unemployment rates, total jobs created, labor participation, and wage trends. When Trump took office in January 2017, the unemployment rate was already declining from post-recession highs. Over the next 3 years, unemployment continued to fall steadily. By early 2020, the unemployment rate had dropped to around 3.5%, one of the lowest levels in 50 years. Minority unemployment rates also reached historic lows during this period. Job growth remained consistent between 2017 and 2019. Millions of jobs were added across sectors such as healthcare, manufacturing, leisure, and professional services. Supporters credit Trump's tax cuts and deregulation policies for encouraging business expansion and hiring. Business optimism during this period reflected strong confidence. However, the labor market experienced an unprecedented shock in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns and business closures caused unemployment to spike dramatically. In April 2020, unemployment surged to nearly 15%, the highest level since the Great Depression. Tens of millions of Americans filed for benefits within weeks. Joe Biden entered the presidency during this recovery phase. In 2021 and 2022, the labor market rebounded rapidly as businesses reopened. Millions of jobs were added in a relatively short period, and unemployment gradually declined again. By mid-presidency, unemployment returned to near historic lows. Supporters argue that Biden oversaw one of the fastest job recoveries in modern history. Government stimulus and infrastructure projects supported this surge. However, critics note that much of the job growth represented recovery of jobs lost during the pandemic rather than entirely new expansion. The argument is about baseline comparison. Another factor is labor force participation. Under Biden, participation improved but did not immediately return to pre-pandemic levels due to retirements and shifting workforce dynamics. Wage growth also became key. Under Biden, nominal wages increased faster, but rising inflation reduced real wage growth, meaning purchasing power did not always improve. Small businesses faced labor shortages during Biden's presidency, which created upward pressure on wages but also raised operating costs for employers. So, who performed better? Trump's strongest numbers came during stable expansion before crisis. Biden's came during rapid recovery after crisis. Both saw historically low unemployment. In Part 4, we will examine inflation, cost of living, and purchasing power, the issue that most directly affects your wallet. Let's look at the reality. If jobs measure opportunity, inflation measures reality. For everyday Americans, the true test of an economy is simple. Can I afford groceries, gas, rent, and mortgage payments? This is where the comparison becomes especially intense. During Trump's pre-pandemic presidency, inflation remained relatively low and stable. Consumer prices rose at moderate rates, typically around 2% annually. Gas prices were generally lower, and mortgage rates were affordable. For many households, purchasing power felt steady. Wage growth often outpaced inflation, meaning real incomes improved slightly. This was supported by stable global supply chains and consistent energy production. However, the pandemic in 2020 disrupted global supply chains. Factories closed and shipping slowed. While inflation didn't spike immediately, the groundwork for future price pressures had begun. When Biden took office in 2021, the economy was already reopening rapidly. Demand for goods surged as consumers spent stimulus payments and savings, but supply chains remained strained. By 2022, inflation had risen to levels not seen in decades. Food prices increased, gas prices surged, rent and housing costs climbed significantly, becoming a major concern for families. Critics argue that large stimulus spending packages under Biden added fuel to inflation. They claim the American Rescue Plan injected too much cash while supply was still constrained. Supporters counter that inflation was a global phenomenon, not unique to the U.S. They point to global pandemic disruptions and geopolitical tensions affecting energy markets everywhere. The Federal Reserve responded by raising interest rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023. This slowed borrowing but also made mortgage rates increase sharply, making home ownership more expensive. The key difference comes down to timing. Many Americans remember lower gas prices under Trump's pre-pandemic years. Under Biden, they experienced price spikes even if wage growth was strong. Purchasing power is deeply personal. In Part 5, we will shift to the markets, how your 401k and retirement accounts performed under both leaders. Let's look at the investments. For millions of Americans, economic success is not just about jobs and prices. It's also about investments, retirement savings, and stock market performance. 401ks, IRAs, and pensions are directly tied to market trends. During Trump's presidency, particularly from 2017 to early 2020, the stock market experienced strong growth. Major indexes like the Dow Jones reached record highs multiple times. Corporate tax cuts in 2017 significantly boosted after-tax profits for companies, which increased earnings per share, a key driver of stock prices. Businesses also engaged in stock buybacks. Investor confidence was high. Deregulation efforts and pro-business messaging reassured markets. Low interest rates also encouraged borrowing and investment, and retirement accounts saw steady gains. However, in early 2020, the pandemic triggered a sharp market crash. Stocks fell rapidly as uncertainty spread. Yet due to aggressive Federal Reserve intervention, the market recovered surprisingly fast. Under Biden, markets initially continued upward momentum during the early recovery phase of 2021. Economic reopening and strong corporate earnings supported stock growth. However, volatility increased significantly in 2022 when inflation surged and the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates aggressively. This created major swings, especially in technology stocks. Higher interest rates tend to reduce stock valuations because borrowing becomes more expensive. Technology stocks, in particular, saw major swings during this period. Despite volatility, markets demonstrated resilience over time. Certain sectors, including energy and infrastructure, performed strongly. By mid to late Biden years, markets stabilized as inflation pressures eased. One important factor is wealth inequality. Rising markets primarily benefit households that own investments. Higher income Americans typically hold more stocks, meaning booms can widen wealth gaps. For 401k holders, both presidencies delivered gains, but with different levels of stability. In Part 6, we will explore the policies behind the numbers, taxes, government spending, and the national debt. When evaluating long-term economic strength, taxes and government spending play a central role. Policies introduced by Donald Trump and Joe Biden significantly influenced federal revenue, deficits, and national debt. One of the defining economic actions under Trump was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The law reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, one of the largest reductions in U.S. history. Supporters argue these cuts stimulated growth, boosted business investment, and encouraged companies to bring overseas profits back to the United States. Individual rates were also lowered. However, critics point out that federal deficits widened during Trump's presidency, even before the pandemic. Lower tax revenue combined with continued spending increased the national debt. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, emergency relief packages added trillions to federal spending. This was bipartisan due to the severity of the crisis, but debt rose significantly by 2017 levels. When Biden took office, large-scale spending continued. The American Rescue Plan provided direct payments, followed by infrastructure and climate-related investment packages. Supporters argue that Biden's spending aimed to strengthen long-term competitiveness. Investments in infrastructure and manufacturing were designed to reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. Critics argue that continued high spending contributed to inflationary pressure and further increased the national debt. Although some tax adjustments targeted high earners, debt levels remained elevated. The key difference lies in tax philosophy. Trump emphasized broad reductions to stimulate private sector growth. Biden emphasized targeted spending and selective tax increases to fund programs. Debt levels matter because rising interest payments consume a growing portion of the budget. As rates increased during Biden's presidency, the cost of servicing debt also rose, creating future pressure. Both administrations contributed to rising deficits under different circumstances. In Part 7, we will explore the backbone of the economy: small businesses, entrepreneurship, and corporate America. Small businesses are often called the backbone of the American economy. They create jobs, drive innovation, and support local communities. So when comparing Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it's essential to examine how each administration impacted entrepreneurs and major corporations. During Trump's presidency, one of the main priorities was deregulation. His administration rolled back numerous federal regulations across industries like energy and manufacturing to reduce compliance costs. Corporate America also benefited from lower taxes. Many companies expanded operations and increased dividends. However, critics argue that large corporations benefited more than small businesses, potentially widening inequality. The pandemic in 2020 created major challenges. Many restaurants, shops, and service providers were forced to shut down. Emergency programs like the Paycheck Protection Program were introduced to provide loans and prevent layoffs. When Biden entered office, many small businesses were still recovering. His administration focused on reopening stimulus support and targeted aid for minority-owned and underserved businesses. However, inflation created new challenges. Rising costs for materials, rent, and wages increased operational expenses for entrepreneurs who often operate with thin margins. Interest rate hikes during Biden's presidency also affected borrowing costs. Loans became more expensive, making expansion more cautious, particularly for technology startups. Under Biden, efforts were made to strengthen domestic manufacturing, particularly in semiconductors. Supporters argue this improves long-term competitiveness. Critics argue it increases government intervention. Entrepreneurship trends showed resilience. New business applications surged during the pandemic recovery period, reflecting shifting work patterns and remote business opportunities during Biden's term. So who was better for small businesses? Trump emphasized deregulation and tax relief during stable years. Biden focused on recovery support and domestic industry rebuilding during a turbulent global environment. In Part 8, we will explore energy policy, gas prices, and household costs, issues that affect every single American. Let's look at the power behind the economy. Energy plays a critical role in the American economy. Gas prices influence transportation costs, food prices, and nearly every product that relies on shipping. That is why energy policy became one of the most visible differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. During Trump's presidency, the administration prioritized domestic energy production. Regulations were reduced, pipelines were approved, and the U.S. became one of the world's largest energy producers. Supporters argue this expansion contributed to lower gas prices and energy independence. This reduced transportation expenses for businesses and everyday commuting costs for households. However, in 2020, global oil demand collapsed during pandemic lockdowns. At one point, oil futures even turned negative. This unique event influenced gas prices more than domestic policy alone. When Biden entered office, energy policy shifted direction. His administration placed greater emphasis on climate goals, renewable energy, and environmental standards. The focus expanded toward electric vehicles, clean energy incentives, and carbon reduction. Supporters argue this transition is necessary for long-term sustainability and climate protection. Critics argue restricting fossil fuel development increases dependence on global markets. When global energy markets tightened due to geopolitical tensions, fuel prices rose significantly in 2022. During Biden's presidency, the administration released oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help stabilize supply. Over time, prices moderated from peak levels, but volatility remained a concern. The economic trade-off centers on stability versus transition. Fossil fuel expansion may lower short-term prices, while renewable investment aims to reduce long-term volatility. For families and businesses, energy costs directly impact profit margins and household budgets. In Part 9, we will explore global trade, tariffs, and supply chains, how America competes on the world stage. After examining economic growth, unemployment, inflation, stock markets, taxes, small businesses, energy policy, and global trade, we can attempt a final comparison between Donald Trump and Joe Biden regarding their impact on American finances. First, GDP. Trump oversaw steady growth fueled by tax cuts before the pandemic. Biden achieved one of the fastest rebounds in decades post-pandemic, though growth later slowed due to inflation. Second, jobs. Trump presided over record low unemployment rates. Biden managed a rapid labor market recovery, bringing unemployment back to near historic lows, though inflation ate into wage gains. Third, inflation. Prices were low and stable during Trump's pre-pandemic years. Under Biden, inflation surged to multi-decade highs due to supply shocks and stimulus, impacting purchasing power. Fourth, markets and debt. Trump's years favored market stability. Biden's years saw volatility but resilience. Both administrations contributed to rising national debt through different mechanisms, tax cuts versus stimulus investment. On business and energy, Trump prioritized deregulation and domestic oil production for lower costs. Biden focused on long-term infrastructure, clean energy transition, and manufacturing resilience. Deciding who was better depends on what metrics matter most. If you prioritize stability and low inflation, Trump's early years look stronger. If you prioritize rapid recovery and long-term investment, Biden's approach may be favored. Ultimately, both presidencies faced unique circumstances. Trump's term was disrupted by a global pandemic. Biden inherited that disruption and managed the chaotic recovery. There is no definitive winner in absolute terms. For American households, the takeaway is clear. Your economic experience is shaped as much by global events as by presidential decisions.